Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Automation, the Car Company Tycoon game. Continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 2011. And the model we're going to be looking at in this video is the Shooting Star, which is the muscle car in the Edison Car Company's lineup. Now, honestly, the last couple of models I have to build have been really frustrating because I've had a lot of crashes happen recently. Right now, the current build of the game seems to be very unstable. As a matter of fact, I was most of the way done building this model, the Shooting Star. I was on the factory setup. I was about halfway through with that, and then a crash happened that wiped out all of my data, so I had to start all over again. And I tried to come in and quickly run through things, and when I was setting up the styling of this model, I forgot to put the taillights on. So as a result, the taillights on all three of the trims we're going to be looking at are going to be slightly different. I tried to put them roughly about the same, but when you have to come in and set them up for each individual trim, there's going to be slight differences, so I apologize for that. Also, I simplified how many trims I had. Initially, I had 5 trims, and I simplified that down to 3. I do have justification for that, but let's go ahead and start off by looking at the body. So the body I'm using is the same body I used for the Star as well as the Orbit. As a result, there is some similarities once we get into the chassis. So this is a monocoque chassis made out of AHS steel. This has a front longitudinal engine placement as opposed to the front transverse that the other two models that use this body used. McPherson strut up front for the suspension and semi-trailing arm in the rear. And the panel material is partial aluminum, which the other two models used corrosion-resistant steel. I already showed you the styling a little bit, but let's go ahead and just do a 360 look around. Now, again, I made things simple here, more so than usual, because, again, I was trying to rebuild this model very quickly from the beginning over again. And as I discussed, I'm using the same body that I used for the Star. So the Star would have used this variant of this body, the 4-door. We're using the 2-door, and the Orbit used the 5-door. Longitudinal rear-wheel drive is the drive type, and for the engine, we have a V6 engine. This is a brand new engine, the HP 3.611. So it's a 3.6-liter displacement, aluminum silicone block, and head, dual overhead cam, with 4 valves per cylinder and VVL. For the crank conrods and pistons, I have forged steel crank, I-beam steel conrods, and lightweight forged pistons. Compression comes in at 10.5, cam profile at 38, VVL profile at 60, and we have VVT all cams. This is a naturally aspirated engine with direct fuel injection system, twin throttle, standard intake, and a regular fuel type. Fuel mixture is at 14.5, ignition timing at 60, and RPM limit at 7,900. I'm using tubular headers, dual exhaust, 2-inch exhaust diameter with a high flow 3-way cat, and a straight through muffler. The end result of that is 301 horsepower and 248 foot-pounds of torque. So hopping into the trim setup, we have a 6-speed sequential gearbox, and this is why I ended up not going with as many trims. The other 2 trims that I omitted were manual gearboxes, and I decided, especially with more modern times, manual gearboxes are becoming rarer and rarer, especially in performance-oriented vehicles. So I decided to keep things simple and just use the sequential gearbox rather than have both a sequential gearbox and trims with manual transmissions. In any case, 6-speed gearbox. The 6th gear is used for an economy gear. So the end result of that is 24.9 miles per gallon and a 0 to 62 time of 5.6 seconds. Wheel spin comes in at 7.9%. We do use a viscous LSD for the differential. The tire setup is sports compound road, 18-inch rims on 235 width in the front and 275 width in the rear. This uses alloy rim material, and the rim choice that I used was this one. Moving on to the brakes, we have solid disc 2-piston up front and solid disc 1-piston in the rear. And we have slightly smaller brake size in the rear. as we didn't need that to really contend with the brake fade. We have a fully clad under tray, and cooling airflow is roughly, or it should be roughly 10 above required, so I was a little bit off there, I guess. In any case, we have 4 seats, standard interior, standard entertainment, and we have power steering, ABS, traction control, and electronic stability control as standard with standard safety. Springs are standard, but we have adaptive dampers and passive sway bars. This is my overall suspension setup. And hopping into the test track, we have a top speed of 173.7 miles an hour. Weight comes in at a little over 3,400 pounds, pretty evenly distributed as far as weight, slightly front heavy. Cornering G's are a little bit better than we've seen in the past. And as a result, I expect this to be one of the better times we've seen so far. And the end result we get is 1 minute 25.84, which is pretty good. Let's jump into the next trim, which is a V8 powered trim, but the same overall interior layout. So taking a look at the engine, this is the MP 5.0 11. This is a V8 engine with an aluminum silicone block and head, 5-liter displacement with dual overhead cam, four valves per cylinder, and VVL. The crank is made out of forged steel, conrods out of I-beam steel, and the pistons are lightweight forged. Compression comes in at 10.5, cam profile at 30, and VVL profile at 64. This has VVT all cams. This is a naturally aspirated engine with a direct fuel injection system and twin throttle setup. Standard intake and regular fuel. Fuel mixture comes in at 14.8, ignition timing at 45, and RPM limit is at 7,700. The exhaust setup, we have tubular headers, dual exhaust, 2.5-inch diameter, and a high-flow 3-way cat with a straight-through muffler. End result of that is 411 horsepower and 334 foot-pound of torque. Taking a look at the gearbox, again, we have a 6-speed sequential gearbox. The 5th and 6th gear go beyond that estimated top speed, again for economy, so the end result of that is 24.3 miles per gallon and a 0 to 62 time of 5.3 seconds. Wheel spin at 8.1%. Tire setup remains the same. Brake setup is slightly different, as we do require bigger brakes in the rear there to contend with brake fade. Cooling airflow is also different, with the same standards, though, of 10 above required cooling. The interior remains the same. Suspension is probably roughly the same, maybe some slight differences because of weight. The test track, we have a top speed of 187.4 miles an hour. The weight comes in at a little over 3,600 pounds. As a result of a heavier engine up front, we're a little bit more front heavy. Cornering G's have dropped because of that increase in weight and more front heavy setup. But we do have a faster top speed and faster 0 to 62 time, so I expect an overall faster time. And that is indeed what we get. Almost losing 2 seconds over our previous time. The last trim we have to look at is the 5-liter Sport Premium trim. Now, there are more differences with this trim as opposed to the previous one we've looked at. So, again, we have a sequential 6-speed gearbox set up roughly the same as the gearbox in our other V8 powered engine. The tire setup remains the same. Brake setup has a little bit of differences, or it should have. I would have added on vented discs. There we go. To reduce the brake fade. Cooling airflow remains the same. Interior, we now have a premium interior and premium entertainment. And another change is in the suspension, where we have an active sport suspension as opposed to the standard spring setup that we had before. And as a result, the suspension is quite a bit different than we saw in the other previous trims. Moving on to the test track, we now have a top speed of 188 miles an hour. Weight has risen to 3,800 pounds. Weight isn't quite as front heavy, though, as it's more evenly distributed now, although cornering G's look to be roughly about the same, although I'm not sure if the cornering speeds are the same. Even though I think we have a slightly quicker top speed, I expect this to be slower than our previous trim because of that increase in weight. And that is indeed the case, as we almost gain half second of time over our previous trim. Any case, that is pretty much going to wrap up our look at this model. I'm not going to really go into the project or model data because this is where I had my crashes before. So I'm going to stay away from that. With the this model and the next model we're going to be looking at is where I had major crashes that made me had to rebuild that model all over again. And I don't really want to do that again. So let's go ahead and open up some of the models we already have built and featured in videos. So we have the constellation, the asteroid, the Luna, the nebula, the orbit, and finally the star. Now, as far as the comparisons go, drivability-wise, this one isn't quite as good of a performer as other models that we have. Yeah, the turbocharged trims in some of these models don't do as well, but none of these are turbocharged, so not really comparable. So if you compare, for instance, to the standard star, we're dropping off quite a bit. At our best, we have 55, which is a couple points off the best that we had in the star previously. And if you compare as far as sportiness to the next best sportiness model, our constellation, again, we're quite a bit below the drivability. But sportiness-wise, this is our strongest model thus far, reaching above 30 in the sportiness numbers, which is better than our previous, high 20s numbers that we got with the constellation. As far as comfort goes, this again is not a very strong performer. With our standard trims, I think this is probably one of our worst performers, as a matter of fact. The only thing worse is the Luna with the manual transmission. I think even our asteroid, yeah, it has better comfort. Now, our premium trim doesn't do too bad at 38, which is decent. Again, doesn't reach other premium trims, but not too bad. Prestige, again, this is probably one of our strongest performers. I would say probably the next best one would be the Constellation here. As we can see, at its highest, we have 37. Whereas with the Shooting Star at our highest, we have 38. So comparable, slightly better in some areas. As far as safety goes, roughly about the same as we saw with the Star before it. Weights are similar, although slightly heavier in some areas. But, V6 versus V6, for instance, we're pretty close in weight. So that's why we're close in safety as well. Practicality-wise, this is, I think, our weakest performer. But it's a performance-oriented vehicle, so we're not really going for that. Off-road ability is, I would say, average, comparable to what we had with the Star. A little bit worse in some areas, but not too bad. Utility-wise, not a bad performer. Compared to all of our other sedan-bodied type vehicles, I think this is the strongest performer we have for the most part. Yeah, it looks like it. Now, obviously, even our Nebula is comparable. So that's pretty good as far as utility goes. As far as reliability, again, this is pretty average. We're doing better in a couple of our trims than the base Star. I would say for the most part we're doing better, because even in the premium trim we're doing better. So slightly better than the standard Star. I wonder if that's just the engine is slightly more reliable overall. Fuel economy isn't quite as good as what we had in the Star, but I think that makes sense as a performance-oriented vehicle. Let's compare it to the Constellation up here. Comparable. V6, we've got 25 miles per gallon, which is what we got here. And our worst is 22, which we do have trims with the Constellation that did worse than that are also V8 powered. So our V8 powered trims here are really not doing too bad. But you also have to consider that the Constellation is quite a bit heavier, though. So as far as missions go, it's not doing too bad. I mean, it's around about what we expect for the year period. As far as production units, this is not a very, a model that takes much in the way of production units to build. I mean, it's outstripping pretty much every other model that we have. Nothing goes that low, which is interesting to see, considering the fact that you would think that wouldn't be the case. You would think that this would take more production units because it has some options. The engines, for one, you would think would take more time to build than the ones in the Star. I mean, even our inline 4 engine Star takes takes more production units to build than our V6 powered shooting Star. That's very interesting to see. Now, cost-wise, we're definitely spending more money than, for instance, the Star, but it's very interesting to see that this is really the lowest production unit vehicle that we have in our lineup. In any case, I think that wraps up the video. I hope you guys have enjoyed. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.